Continuing on with the US now, in terms of radio, radio is almost entirely commercial in the United States and almost entirely local in the United States. Just think about that, what a big break that is from the other countries that we've studied so far. That means that on almost every radio station in the United States, you can hear advertising. The exception are those non-commercial radio stations, which you find at universities, and also NPR. And NPR is one of those exceptions for national radio. But it's not that NPR stations are national. No, in fact, WVIA, for example, right here in Scranton with the repeater site getting a signal to East Stroudsburg University, is a local station that happens to carry some NPR programming, shows like Morning Edition, for example. So we don't really have true national radio in the United States, period. Whereas in other countries, you find national radio. All right, and then TV is a similar story, very commercial. You have your PBS, but even your educational channels like Discovery, they still run advertising. So television, almost everybody is watching TV still in the United States. It's on in the background. The usage of TV has declined somewhat. We'll talk about the hours when we get to the hours that people use TV for in America when we get to the audience part of this chapter. But TV is very prevalent. The average home has a minimum of 3 TVs to it these days, and probably even more. That stat is probably out of date. Most people have cable, except in power outages, right, during storms. And the rest have satellite for the most part, although increasingly people are cutting the cable and going strictly to streaming. All right, moving on to Mexico now. Mexico starts to get us into some problematic countries in terms of getting a hold of certain kinds of information. Mexico, the penetration of newspapers is not known. It's not known. And yet, if you were to go to Mexico, you would see just scores of newspapers everywhere you go. Newsstands, vendors walking through the streets, at convenience stores. There's a ton of newspapers in Mexico. You have to wonder who's reading all these newspapers. Who really knows? That's the question, because there are no figures available. Why are there no figures available? Well, because the newspapers want to keep that a secret, because they have that nice, sweet deal with governments where governments are renting out a page. And so they don't want to jeopardize that. They don't want the government to realize circulation figures are lower. And to some extent, they're not even sure if circulation figures are accurate, because in Mexico, the average person passes on a newspaper. So just because one person bought it doesn't mean that only one person is reading it. They share in Mexico. In radio, you find Mexico has a love affair, in part because Mexico is such a musical country. Everywhere you go, people play instruments in Mexico. Almost every family has 2 or 3 instrument players, guitar players. Or the part of Mexico I go to, the sousaphone is a big instrument that's used in these giant bands. They call them bandas. In Mexico, you have a lot of music, and so you have a lot of radio stations delivering that content. It's a very festive country. So the average household has 3 radio receivers, but today people are listening like everybody else around the world. They're picking up their cell phone and they're going to tune in and putting their headphones in, and they're listening that way. But you still find music being distributed by radio as well, especially in vehicles, just like here in the U.S. In television in Mexico, you have distribution going on. Only 70% of households are getting TV in Mexico, and that's one of the few countries I'm even mentioning that statistic, because it just does point out that TV is not a big medium in terms of it reaching as much of the population as other populations are reached. But you do see a lot of TV watching in Mexico, especially since it's a fair weather country. You see people with TVs with cables run all the way to some power source. It could be across the street. And they have this tiny little TV that they're watching at a taco stand. Or they have a TV in their taxi waiting for a fare. Or you find TV, on people's, they don't have porches necessarily, but you see the doors open to houses with the TV on all over Mexico. In Mexico, there are 2 national networks. We're not talking channels now. We're getting into a similar system as the U.S. networks, right, which is a collection of stations which receive programming from a studio. The network studio, like NBC, makes the programs and then distributes them to affiliate stations. It's a network. It's not the same as a channel. In Mexico, you got 2 networks, 2 big ones. You've got Televisa, Televisa, and you've got Azteca, Azteca. Over to China now. In China, the penetration of newspapers is also very high. Not as high as Sweden, but close. 74% of people getting daily newspapers. And we would expect that to be high anyhow, right? Because we already know that the government distributes newspapers. We've got a photograph of that on page 167. The newspaper viewing frames posted government communist newspapers, making sure to get the message out about the benefits of the Communist Party, looking after the people, improving their situation, rising up their standards of living. I'm speaking in a way that I hope is getting across. It is propaganda, whether it's completely false or not. We really can't judge, but this is what's going on in the Chinese newspaper being distributed for free in the viewing frames, and people like this guy here on his bicycle can stop and read. So we have high distribution of newspapers, and we have a big balance between communist newspapers and other newspapers, even though the other newspapers carrying advertising are not going to be criticizing the government. It's just understood, right? Because it's communism, and it's the communist society. And so then we go on to television. Television, similar situation here. And, radio. I want to come back to radio. Radio is a very weak medium in China. You don't see many people listening to radio. I think part of the reason for that is because it is a very visual society. That's why you have so many characters in the Chinese, well, it's not an alphabet. In the Chinese language system, you have 10,000 characters. And that's why in China you have such brilliant Chinese operas, which we'll study later here. There's a lot of visualness to the culture, and I think that the oral part of it is downplayed to some extent. That's just a personal theory that I have. So radio is not that important. And when I was traveling around the two parts of China I went to, Shanghai and Beijing, I can't remember a single time I heard anybody listening to the radio. TV-wise, a lot of people watching TV, though. That's a different story. And in fact, the Chinese government has all those CCTV channels. I mean, geez, how many channels can you have, TV-wise? There's 9 of them. And one of them is directed strictly at populations around the world that are speaking English to present a face of China to the rest of the world. You can get CCTV right here on Blue Ridge Communication. I hope that you're interested enough to go check it out. It's China Central Television, CCTV. It's government, Chinese government. It's in English. CCTV 9 is in English. Check it out. All right, moving on now to Ghana. In Ghana, also, penetration of newspapers unavailable. You would expect that, right? It's a struggling, developing country. Not everybody can read a newspaper. We know that because some only speak oral languages. Getting a newspaper, do I get bread? Do I get a newspaper? I think I'm getting bread, right? So you have a lot of barriers to overcome to get newspapers to distribute in Ghana. But at the same time, newspapers had a very strong role in the revolution which brought democracy to Ghana. So there is a big interest journalistically, professionally, governmentally in making sure that it's a robust newspaper industry. That's why you still have a government-owned and run newspaper, the Daily Graphic, which is not necessarily pro-government in a flagrant way. It's a pro-government in a soft way, I guess you could say. And it's describing that relationship in developing countries between the government helps media and the media help the government. And then you've also got a lot of private newspapers. They're the ones who led that revolution. So they have their own journalistic independence that they're dependent on maintaining. And note that the entertainment side, the tabloid side, almost doesn't exist in Ghana. There's entertainment, but it's more like a sports star, a soccer star, and where he likes to eat with his wife. It's not the kind of sensationalist, catching somebody in a scandal kind of tabloid journalism. Now we come to radio, the most important medium, mass medium-wise, in Ghana. Radio fits on top of the oral culture. The radio is portable. Ghana is very language-based, very oral language-based. It's cheap, right? It's easy to get the signal. So radio has a lot of possibilities in Ghana, and that's why you do have the development of radio, though a lot of radio in Ghana is simply talk stations, just people debating issues, as you would expect to have in a developing country. Now we go to television. In television, Ghana is still struggling to get that industry to be a 24-hour-a-day, self-sustaining industry. And by that I mean that you even have TV stations in Ghana that close down because they don't have the programming, or you have TV stations just running flat out programming from other countries like Nigeria. They run a lot of Nigerian music videos in Ghana, and of course the US. And of the programs that are produced, some of them are extremely basic in their lighting, their set design, the costuming, the scripting, everything. So TV access in Ghana, we can say, is still a fledgling industry, even though there are some channels that are being established as regular TV channels. And then we come to Lebanon now. Lebanon, remember, such a tiny country. It really influences accessibility of media in many respects, and also the fact that it was invaded by France, invaded by Britain. Other powers came over to Lebanon. So newspaper-wise, we have very low penetration at 29.4%, but that's because the newspapers are so out of touch with the average citizen. The newspapers in Lebanon are very political or very religious or very ethnic. You got those three things as what's being discussed: political, religious, ethnic. The next cut down would be a newspaper that has a foreign content influence to it. So we actually have newspapers that are foreign that have their operations in Lebanon, the Orient, for example, and British newspapers as well. So those actually operate within Lebanon. How strange is that? Could you imagine having, for example, an Iranian newspaper printing in Pennsylvania? We would never envision that. But Lebanon used to being crossed over by other countries. That's what goes on. So you actually have a ton of newspapers, and look at how many of them under basic content on page 177 are serious. They're all serious, out of touch. And also each one is so tightly focused that it has very little appeal to anybody outside of an ethnicity or a particular religion that it's aimed at. Radio-wise, because you can get a radio signal to any part of the country, radio is very, very popular in Lebanon. In fact, it has the highest ratio of radio receivers out of any country, any of the Arabic countries. And you can just get radio where you can drive all day long in Lebanon and get the same radio station. So you can imagine how that leads to a really robust listening environment. TV access is pretty steady. There's 2 television sets is the average. And on TV, you do find, on the television lineup, you do find several stations that you can get that are channels. You've got at least 7 or 8 channels there. But one thing to note about Lebanon is a lot of the material is either imported from other countries, or they take an idea, let's say American Idol, and then they copy it and they do it in Lebanon. And nobody really goes after them because it's done very quickly. It doesn't run on the air for that long. You're not going to get any money anyhow, copyright infringement. But they basically mock the structure, except they do it in a much more primitive and what would be, from our vantage point as the people who see the real pop idol, we would think of it as very amateurish kind of programming. That very much characterizes Lebanese TV. So, okay, there's some of my own interpretations that go into the accessibility of media in addition to some of the hard facts that we know, but it returns us to the idea that when we travel around in our daily existence, what are we likely to be exposed to? What do we have to work hard to get exposed to media-wise, and what do we not even know is out there because we're not exposed to it? That's really the bigger question that I'm hoping this class is starting to answer. I hope you have a great day.